All right, welcome to the Week 11 Forum and to the third and final unit of the course. This week we address one of the central institutions of American government. Congress and the executive branch is where most of what Americans think of as politics occurs at the federal level. This week we'll be discussing the role of Congress in our system, and of course in the subsequent week we'll deal with the presidency. With Congress, the first thing we need to note is that there are two houses of Congress. Why did the framers create a bicameral legislature? What distinctive roles do the House of Representatives and the Senate play in the legislative process? A major rationale for a bicameral legislature, or a major kind of factor in it, was the Great Compromise, which we discussed way back in Chapter 2. That ensured that the interests of the smaller states were basically going to receive greater weight in the Senate, while the House of Representatives would represent the, presumably narrower interests of the federal districts. What is the impact of bicameralism today? Some scholars argue that the mere existence of the Senate as a political institution creates an unfair advantage for low population states, which disproportionately have been controlled by one ideological set of interests in recent years. As you read this chapter, you should also think about the role that representation plays in modern government. Congresspersons should represent all of the members of their district, and that poses interesting questions, related to the nature of representation. Can a wealthy man represent the interests of the poorer members of their district? Can a man represent women? Can a white man represent the interests of his or her black constituents? Can or should a Democratic representative fairly represent the interests of their Republican constituents, and vice versa? These questions focus our attention on what representation really means and what it requires, right? Does a person have to have been poor to understand the needs of the poor? Many scholars view Edward Kennedy as historically one of the most powerful advocates on behalf of the poor in the history of the Senate, at least. And no one thinks he spent a moment experiencing actual poverty. Perhaps the most important attribute of a congressperson, of an effective congressperson and an effective representative, is empathy, right? The ability to put yourself in another's shoes, and the capacity to recognize that public service sometimes means doing the right thing and not the partisan thing. Another important question revolves around the kind of people that are elected to the House and the Senate. There are a few common characteristics. White males tend to be overrepresented. Congress as a whole is older than the mean populations they represent. On average, members of Congress are considerably wealthier than their constituents. And that tendency is markedly greater in the Senate, which is often described as a millionaire's club. A significant percentage of both House and Senate members have practiced law for the reasons that understanding the law can provide a person with important foundational aspects of drafting legislation. But the fact that members of Congress are generally successful people means that they come from the upper strata of their communities, and as a result may not be particularly aware of or sensitive to the needs of their more economically distressed constituents. I raised the issue of gerrymandering in the overview, and I think that it's one of the most serious challenges confronting our politics. What are the negative consequences that result from gerrymandering? What kinds of reforms would you advocate to reform the redistricting process? Feel free to conduct some independent reading of your own, or if you ask me, I can send you articles. Bring what you find into the forum. I also would have another modest proposal regarding kind of representation. In addition to redistricting reform, I would advocate periodic reapportionment of the states. I would propose an amendment to the Constitution to prohibit any state population from exceeding 15 million, or to be smaller than 6 million, with exceptions for non-contiguous states. Getting rid of the megastates like California and the microstates like Wyoming, in my view, would lead to better, more effective representation. What do you think? Another issue addressed in the chapter is pork barrel politics, which results from a phenomenon known as log rolling, where members of Congress will trade votes in exchange for other members' support on their pet projects, usually including money earmarked for their states and districts. So, the late Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia was known as the king of pork and managed to bring an estimated $7.3 billion in federal aid back to his state, which is why so many roads, buildings, and schools were named after him. Look, it's a commonplace for Americans to complain about corruption and to condemn pork barrel politics and earmarks as a waste of taxpayer dollars and again, as a source of corruption. But another way of looking at pork barrel politics is that it's the price of politics. One person's pork barrel is another person's very important project, which may mean a road that connects towns in a district that increases economic activity, or it may mean a veterans center in a small town that lacked the resources for veterans. In other words, it's not a simple black or white issue. Another important part of congressional organization is the committee system, which provides insight into how Congress works on a day-to-day basis. Woodrow Wilson, the only political scientist to become a president, once observed that Congress in session is Congress on exhibition, whilst Congress in its committee rooms is Congress at work. What are the different kinds of committees that enable Congress to efficiently produce legislation and perform its oversight responsibilities? Which, in your view, are the most important committees? Another issue that I want to address regarding this chapter is, of course, the lawmaking responsibilities. The first thing we should recognize is that most legislation that's proposed in any two-year legislative session is destined to fail. Legislation fails for a variety of reasons. Sometimes legislators propose legislation as a stunt to draw attention to an issue that puts their personal prospects in a good light and is never intended to be acted upon. Sometimes the legislative process uncovers serious flaws in proposed legislation that causes more problems than it solves. Sometimes the legislation is well-meaning but controversial, and sometimes legislation is defeated because it would work adversely to the interests of very wealthy and powerful people. It's always important to recognize that the legislative process, when it's working effectively, is designed to produce sound laws that work for the common good. It doesn't happen as much as it should. Unfortunately, that's an increasingly rare occurrence. If you look back to the 1940s and 50s, Congress routinely passed in excess of 800 pieces of legislation. And in the 1955-56 session, passed over 1,000 pieces of legislation. Since the 1980s, however, Congress has been less and less effective. And in the 2011-12 session, Congress passed fewer than 200 pieces of legislation. And this year's session has been similarly unproductive. Is this a problem? Former House Speaker John Boehner once argued that Congress shouldn't be judged as effective because of the law it passed, but rather it should be judged on the basis of the bad laws they reverse. Is that a reasonable standard? It's a possibility, but I think that there was a perspective driving that. The text appropriately notes that Congress commits a great deal of time and energy to activities other than legislating. A significant part of Congress's responsibility lies in oversight, which is an essential part of Congress's Article I legislative authority. In conducting oversight, congressional committees and subcommittees have tremendous authority to gather information, including issuing subpoenas. And if you don't know what a subpoena is, please feel free to ask me in the forum. Additionally, a great deal of legislation includes periodic reporting requirements, which require executive branch officials to appear before designated committees to offer updates on the activities of their agencies. The text also describes the role each House of Congress plays in the impeachment process. Impeachment has recently, of course, dominated the news, with House Democrats attempting to impeach President Donald Trump. What offenses did House Democratic leadership view that Trump had done that justified impeachment? What role does the House play in impeachment? What about the Senate? What role does the Chief Justice play in impeachments of the President and Vice President? How many of you actually watched or read about media accounts of the impeachment process? Having studied impeachment at various points over the course of my academic career, I think there are a couple of important points. One, as it relates to the political offices covered by the impeachment process. Impeachment is a constitutional process, meaning that the framers clearly envisioned instances where wrongful actions or inactions by a president or vice president would demand their immediate removal without recourse to the electoral process. They wrote it into the rule book. And two, impeachment, particularly of the political officers covered, is an intensely political process. And the successful removal of a president or vice president requires tremendous moral courage on the part of the senators of the president or the vice president facing removal of the same party. As the Trump impeachment process suggests, senators opposing their party's political officers face a real likelihood of ending their political careers. And senators don't become senators by taking those kinds of risks. Senators tend to be fairly risk averse. Which aspects of the impeachment process most interested or upset you? Why? What aspect of it got you going? What was your reaction to the outcome of the impeachment process, or the likely outcome? If you supported President Trump's impeachment, what grounds did you find most persuasive for his removal? If you opposed his removal, why did you believe Donald Trump deserved to be sustained in office? All right, let's jump into it. Let me know if there's anything from the text or my mini lecture that you don't understand, and I'll try to clear things up. Let's have a great week.